Donald Trump scoffed as he walked past the ceremonial line, muttering, "These guys have never seen a battlefield in their life." His words were caught on camera and echoed through the courtyard. What he didn't realize, though, was that the motionless man in the red ceremonial uniform wasn't just any soldier. He was a decorated battlefield veteran with a sealed service record and a background in law. That same man would go on to take Trump to court, filing a $100 million lawsuit that uncovered truths the public was never meant to hear, and by the time the verdict was delivered, Trump's entire political legacy was hanging by a thread. Before we reveal what came out in court, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story changes everything. The morning of October 15th, 2024, started like any other for Thomas Wren. The former Royal Guard, now 54, was preparing breakfast for his daughter Sarah when the phone rang. His wife Margaret answered, her face growing pale as she listened. On the other end was a journalist from the Telegraph, asking for comment about statements made by Donald Trump during his latest London press conference the night before. Trump had been particularly caustic, standing outside the American embassy, with his characteristic smugness. "These so-called royal guards," he had said, gesturing dismissively toward Buckingham Palace, "they're basically human statues in funny hats. I mean, come on, when's the last time they saw real combat? They're glorified mannequins. My secret service could take them all down with one hand tied behind their back." Sad. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. 23 years of service, including 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, 3 Purple Hearts, a Distinguished Service Cross, and scars that still ached on rainy mornings, all reduced to glorified mannequin by a man who had famously avoided military service with bone spurs. Sarah, now 12, was getting ready for school when she saw her father's face. She had inherited his steel-grey eyes and stubborn chin, but right now those eyes were filling with tears. "Daddy," she whispered, "my friends at school are going to see this, aren't they?" Thomas knelt beside his daughter, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Listen to me, Sarah. Sometimes people say things that aren't true because they don't understand what real service means. But the truth has a way of coming out." That afternoon, Thomas found himself sitting across from Elena Pike, one of London's most formidable defamation lawyers. Pike had made her reputation taking on media giants and winning. Her office walls were lined with framed newspaper clippings of her victories, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "Mr. Wren," she said, sliding a cup of tea across the mahogany desk, "I've been following your case since this morning. What Trump said wasn't just insulting, it was demonstrably false and malicious. But I have to ask, are you prepared for what this will cost? Not just financially, but personally." Thomas stared out the window at the London skyline, his mind drifting to a dusty valley in Helmand Province, 2018. He could still hear the crack of sniper fire, still smell the cordite and blood. "Ms. Pike," he said quietly, "I didn't survive 3 IEDs and carry 2 wounded Marines to safety, so some politician could call me a mannequin. This isn't just about MITs, about every veteran who can't fight back." The decision to sue for £100 million wasn't made lightly. Pike had spent weeks building the case, interviewing former colleagues, gathering service records, and most importantly, uncovering video evidence that would later become the centerpiece of their strategy. The filing made international headlines. CNN, BBC, Fox News. Everyone wanted to know about the Royal Guard, who was taking on the former President of the United States. Thomas had deliberately chosen to remain silent during the media frenzy, following Pike's advice to let our evidence speak in court. Trump's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the filing, he was on Truth Social, calling the lawsuit a witch hunt by the failing British legal system and claiming Thomas was a nobody looking for his 15 minutes of fame. The post garnered thousands of shares and comments, most echoing Trump's sentiment that the case was frivolous. But Pike had been preparing for this moment for months. In her Mayfair office, surrounded by legal briefs and evidence boxes, she worked 18-hour days with her team. They had uncovered something extraordinary: helmet camera footage from Thomas's final tour in Afghanistan. Video that had been classified until recently, but was now available through a Freedom of Information Act request. The footage was devastating. It showed Thomas, then Staff Sergeant Wren of the Welsh Guards, during a Taliban ambush in the Sangin Valley. American Marines from the 2nd Battalion had been pinned down by sniper fire when their convoy hit an IED. Thomas's unit had been patrolling nearby when they heard the explosion and automatic weapons fire. What the camera captured next would become legendary in military circles. Thomas, under heavy fire, had sprinted across 200 meters of open ground to reach the disabled American vehicle. Inside was Sergeant Jake Ryler from Ohio and Corporal Luis Mendez from Texas, both severely wounded and unable to move. For minutes Thomas had held that position alone, returning sniper fire while applying field dressings to both Marines. When Taliban fighters moved to flank their position, Thomas had made the decision that would define his character forever. He had dragged both wounded Americans, each weighing over 180 pounds with gear, through a gauntlet of machine gun fire to safety. The helmet cam footage showed everything: Thomas's labored breathing, his tactical radio calls for support, the way he shielded the wounded Marines with his own body. At one point, clearly audible on the recording, Sergeant Ryler had whispered, "I'm not gonna make it, man." Thomas's response, delivered while reloading his rifle under fire, would later be quoted in military academies. "Not today, Marine. Not on my watch." As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for legal warfare. Trump had hired Sir Malcolm Blackwood, one of Britain's most expensive barristers, known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to make juries forget the facts in favor of emotion. Blackwood's strategy was simple: paint Thomas as an opportunist, seeking to cash in on Trump's celebrity, while arguing that political commentary, however harsh, was protected speech. Pike, meanwhile, had assembled a team of military experts, character witnesses, and most importantly, she had tracked down the 2 Marines that Thomas had saved. Both men had agreed to testify. Despite the potential political backlash in their home country, Jake Ryler was now a police sergeant in Cleveland, married with 2 children. The shrapnel from that IED had left him with a permanent limp and partial hearing loss, but he was alive. Luis Mendez had returned to his family's ranch in Texas, where he raised cattle and taught riding lessons to disabled veterans. Both men credited Thomas Wren with saving their lives. The preliminary hearings had been contentious. Blackwood had argued that Trump's comments were obvious political hyperbole, and that no reasonable person would take them as statements of fact. He painted his client as a victim of British legal overreach, suggesting that the case was motivated by anti-American sentiment rather than genuine harm. Pike countered with evidence of the real-world impact of Trump's words. She presented social media posts showing Thomas being mocked online, his daughter being bullied at school, and veteran support groups expressing outrage at the characterization of military service members as mannequins. The psychological evaluation of Thomas showed signs of renewed PTSD, triggered not by combat memories but by the public humiliation of having his service dismissed so callously. The media circus surrounding the case had grown to unprecedented levels. Protesters gathered daily outside the royal courts of justice, some supporting Trump's right to free speech, others carrying signs reading "Veterans are not mannequins and respect our heroes." American tourists found themselves awkwardly navigating the political minefield that London had become. Thomas himself remained largely out of sight, spending his days in preparation with Pike's team and his evenings with his family. Margaret had taken leave from her teaching position to shield Sarah from the worst of the media attention, but the strain was showing on all of them. In quiet moments, Thomas wondered if he had made the right choice. The legal fees alone, even with Pike working on contingency, were mounting into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. It was during one of these darker moments that Thomas received an unexpected visitor. General Sir Patrick Morrison, his former commanding officer, arrived unannounced at the Wren family home in Surrey. Morrison, now retired but still carrying himself with military bearing, sat in Thomas's modest living room and spoke words that would sustain him through the trial ahead. "Thomas," the general said, "what you're doing isn't just about you. Every soldier, sailor, airman, and marine who's ever served is watching this case. Win or lose, you've already shown them that their service matters enough to fight for. That's worth more than any amount of money." The trial began on a crisp November morning with unprecedented security. The Royal Courts of Justice had implemented measures typically reserved for terrorism cases, with metal detectors, bomb-sniffing dogs, and armed police stationed throughout. The building judge, Sir Reginald Hayes, a veteran of high-profile cases, including several involving international figures, presided with his characteristic nonsense demeanor. The gallery was packed with an unusual mix of military veterans, journalists, legal observers, and curious members of the public who had managed to secure seats through the lottery system. Trump arrived in a motorcade that seemed more suited to a head of state than a defendant. His usual entourage of advisors and security personnel, creating a spectacle on Fleet Street. Thomas, in contrast, walked into the courthouse with quiet dignity, wearing his dress uniform adorned with the ribbons representing his decades of service. The sight of him, tall, straight-backed, grey temples touched with silver, created a stark visual contrast to Trump's theatrical entrance. Margaret and Sarah sat in the front row, Sarah wearing a small lapel pin featuring the Welsh Guards' regimental crest. Pike's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric. She began not with Thomas's military record, but with the fundamental question of what words mean and how they can destroy lives. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "we are here because words have power." The defendant's words were not mere political commentary. They were a calculated attack on the character and honor of every person who has ever worn the uniform of their country. She outlined the case methodically. Trump's statements were false. They were made with malicious intent, and they had caused substantial harm to Thomas's reputation and livelihood. But most importantly, they represented a broader pattern of disrespect for military service that had real consequences for real people. Blackwood's opening was equally polished, but took a different approach. He portrayed Trump as a victim of European elites who couldn't tolerate American directness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "this case represents nothing less than an attack on free speech itself. Are we to say that politicians cannot express their opinions? That commentary on public institutions is now subject to the whims of foreign courts?" The first week of testimony focused on establishing Thomas's credibility and service record. Pike called a parade of witnesses, fellow soldiers who had served with Thomas, superior officers who could speak to his character, and military historians who could contextualize the role of the Royal Guards in modern warfare. Each testimony built upon the last, creating an unassailable portrait of a career soldier who had served with distinction in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation in the world. Colonel James Hartwell, who had commanded Thomas's regiment during the Helmand deployment, provided particularly powerful testimony. "Staff Sergeant Wren," he said, looking directly at Thomas, "was the kind of soldier you wanted with you when everything went wrong. Not because he was fearless, any fool can be fearless. Because he was brave, and there's a difference. Brave means being afraid and doing your duty anyway." The defense's strategy became clear during cross-examination. Blackwood attempted to paint Thomas as a glory seeker, questioning why he had kept copies of the helmet camera footage and suggesting that his decision to sue was motivated by financial gain rather than genuine injury. But Thomas's responses, delivered in his quiet, measured tone, deflected each attack with simple truth. The second week brought the moment everyone had been waiting for, the presentation of the helmet camera footage. Pike had saved this evidence for maximum impact, and the courtroom fell silent as the large screens flickered to life. The grainy, military-quality video showed the chaos of combat with brutal clarity. The footage began with Thomas's unit responding to the IED explosion, the camera bouncing as he ran across rough terrain toward the sound of gunfire. When the American convoy came into view, two vehicles, one overturned and smoking, the scope of the disaster became clear. Bodies were scattered around the lead vehicle, some moving, others ominously still. Thomas's voice came through clearly on the audio contact front. "American casualties need immediate medical support." His tactical awareness was evident as he assessed the situation, identified the sniper positions, and formulated his rescue plan. The camera captured his sprint across open ground, bullets kicking up dust around him as he reached the disabled vehicle. Inside, the footage showed scenes that would haunt viewers long after the trial ended. Sergeant Ryler was conscious but bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to his chest and legs. Corporal Mendez was unconscious, his left arm bent at an impossible angle, blood pooling beneath his head. Thomas's hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying pressure dressings, checking airways, all while coordinating with his unit over radio. The most powerful moment came 23 minutes into the footage, when Taliban fighters began flanking their position. Thomas made the decision to move the wounded Americans to better cover, but this meant exposing himself completely to enemy fire. The camera showed him dragging Ryler first, the wounded Marine leaving a trail of blood in the sand. Then Mendez, heavier and unconscious, requiring multiple trips to move him and his equipment. Throughout it all, Thomas maintained his composure. When Ryler whispered that he wasn't going to make it, Thomas's response was captured clearly. "You're going home, Marine. I promise you that." When Mendez briefly regained consciousness and asked about his arm, Thomas lied smoothly. "Just a scratch, son. You'll be playing guitar again in no time." The jury was visibly affected by the footage. Several jurors wiped away tears during the 47-minute ordeal, and one woman in the front row covered her mouth in horror when a sniper's bullet passed so close to Thomas that the camera shook from the shockwave. Judge Hayes called for a brief recess when it became clear that the emotional impact of the evidence was overwhelming the courtroom. Trump's reaction to the footage was telling. Rather than showing respect for Thomas's heroism, he seemed irritated by the attention it was receiving. He was observed checking his phone during the most dramatic moments and was caught on camera rolling his eyes when the jury gasped at Thomas dragging the wounded Marines to safety. When Pike rose for redirect examination, she asked Thomas a simple question. "Sergeant Wren, in your 23 years of service, how many times were you called a mannequin?" Thomas's answer was delivered with quiet dignity. "Never, ma'am. Not until the defendant decided that my service, and the service of every Royal Guard, was worth mocking for political gain." The defense's attempts to undermine the footage fell flat. Blackwood suggested that Thomas had kept the video for some, but military protocol experts testified that all helmet camera footage was automatically preserved for after-action reviews and training purposes. When Blackwood implied that the rescue was routine for military personnel, Pike called General Morrison to explain that Thomas's actions had resulted in a recommendation for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, which had been declassified only recently due to operational security concerns. The third week brought surprise witnesses that neither side had fully anticipated. Jake Ryler and Luis Mendez had flown to London at their own expense, despite pressure from various political groups in the United States to stay home. Their testimony would prove to be the turning point in the case. Ryler took the stand first, his police uniform crisp and professional, but his limp evident as he walked to the witness box. Pike's questioning was gentle but thorough, allowing Ryler to tell his story in his own words. He described the IED explosion, the confusion and pain, and then the moment when Thomas appeared like an angel in camouflage. "I thought I was dead," Ryler testified, his voice strong despite the emotional weight of his words. "The pain was incredible, and I could hear the Taliban closing in. Then this British soldier appears, starts working on my wounds, and tells me I'm going home. I didn't believe him at first. I could feel my life draining away, but he kept talking to me, keeping me conscious, and he never stopped fighting." Mendez's testimony was even more powerful because he spoke with the simple eloquence of someone who had genuinely processed his trauma. The rancher from Texas looked directly at Thomas as he spoke. "That man saved my life, plain and simple. I was unconscious for most of it, but I remember waking up in his arms as he carried me to the helicopter. I remember thinking, this guy doesn't even know my name, but he's willing to die for me. That's not a mannequin, that's a hero." The defense's cross-examination of both Marines was a disaster. Blackwood's attempts to suggest that their gratitude was exaggerated, or that they were politically motivated, backfired spectacularly. When he asked Ryler if he was being compensated for his testimony, Ryler's response was devastating. "Sir, I used my vacation time and my own money to come here. The only payment I want is for people to know the truth about the man who saved my life." Even more damaging was Blackwood's attempt to minimize the rescue by suggesting that other soldiers would have done the same thing. Mendez's response was immediate and powerful. "Maybe they would have, sir, but they didn't. Staff Sergeant Wren did. And when your client calls him a mannequin, he's spitting in the face of every person who's ever risked their life for someone else." The week also brought unexpected testimony from Dr. Sarah Williams, a trauma psychologist who had been treating Thomas since the Trump comments became public. Her professional assessment was clinical but damning. Thomas was suffering from a renewed bout of PTSD, not triggered by his combat experiences, but by the public humiliation and dismissal of his service. The defendant's comments, Dr. Williams, testified, represented a fundamental attack on Mr. Wren's core identity. For a career soldier, having their service dismissed as meaningless performance art is psychologically devastating. It's akin to telling a doctor they're just playing dress-up, or telling a teacher they're just babysitting. But worse, because military service involves life-and-death decisions and genuine sacrifice. The psychological impact extended beyond Thomas himself. Margaret Wren testified about finding their daughter crying in her room after classmates had repeated Trump's comments. At school, Sarah, now 13, had developed anxiety symptoms and had asked to be homeschooled rather than face continued harassment from peers who thought her father was a fraud. Pike's strategy was working perfectly. She had established Thomas's heroism, beyond any reasonable doubt, demonstrated the falsity and maliciousness of Trump's comments, and shown clear evidence of substantial harm. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. The fourth week brought Trump himself to the witness stand. The former president's testimony had been eagerly anticipated by media outlets worldwide, and his appearance did not disappoint in terms of spectacle. Dressed in his typical dark suit and red tie, Trump took the stand with his characteristic confidence, seemingly unbothered by the gravity of the proceedings. Pike's cross-examination was a surgical dismantling of Trump's credibility. She began with his own military record, or lack thereof. When she asked about his Vietnam-era deferments, Trump became defensive, claiming bone spurs had prevented his service. Pike then presented medical records, showing he had been actively playing sports during the same period, including tennis and golf tournaments. "Mr. Trump," Pike said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute preparation, "you've claimed that royal guards are glorified mannequins who have never seen real combat. Are you familiar with the operational history of the regiment of guards?" Trump's answer revealed his complete ignorance of military history. "Look, they stand around in those silly hats. They march back and forth. It's all for show. Very sad, actually." Pike then presented a devastating timeline. Guards regiments had served in every major British conflict for centuries, including recent deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they had sustained significant casualties. The Coldstream Guards alone had lost 14 soldiers in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2014, including 2 who had died in the same operation where Thomas had saved American Marines. When confronted with the helmet camera footage of Thomas's heroic actions, Trump's response was telling. Rather than acknowledging the bravery displayed, he doubled down. "Listen, that's what soldiers are supposed to do. It's their job. I would have done the same thing, probably better." The courtroom erupted at this statement. Judge Hayes had to call for order multiple times as spectators voiced their disbelief. Even some members of the jury were visibly shocked at Trump's casual dismissal of extraordinary courage under fire. Pike pressed her advantage. "Mr. Trump, you stated you would have done better than Staff Sergeant Wren. Can you describe your combat experience that qualifies you to make such an assessment?" Trump's response was rambling and defensive. "I don't need combat experience to recognize good leadership. I'm a natural leader. I would have gotten those soldiers out faster and with less drama. It's all about efficiency." The most damaging moment came when Pike asked Trump about his knowledge of the 2 Marines who had been saved. It became clear that, despite awarding them medals at the White House, Trump had no memory of Ryler and Mendez or their story. When shown photographs of the ceremony, Trump insisted he remembered but could provide no details about their service or injuries. Blackwood's redirect examination attempted damage control, but Trump proved to be his own worst enemy. When asked about the context of his original comments, Trump expanded on his criticism. "These guards, they're very overrated. My Secret Service agents are much better. They actually protect important people instead of standing around tourist attractions." The comparison to his Secret Service detail was particularly ill-advised, given recent security failures that had been widely publicized. Pike's recross-examination highlighted Trump's pattern of disparaging military and law enforcement personnel, while simultaneously claiming to support them. By the time Trump left the witness stand, even neutral observers could see that his testimony had been catastrophic for his case. His combination of ignorance, arrogance, and casual cruelty had provided Pike with everything she needed to demonstrate malicious intent. The 5th week brought closing arguments, and both sides pulled out all the stops. Blackwood's closing was a passionate defense of free speech principles, arguing that Trump's comments, however distasteful, represented protected political commentary. He painted the case as a dangerous precedent that would chill political discourse and give foreign courts power over American political figures. Ladies and gentlemen, Blackwood argued, we cannot allow hurt feelings, however understandable, to override fundamental principles of free expression. If we rule against my client today, where does it end? Can every politician who makes an unfortunate comment be hauled into court by anyone who takes offense? But Pike's closing argument was a masterpiece that would be studied in law schools for years to come. She began not with legal precedents, but with a simple question: what is the difference between an opinion and a lie? She methodically dismantled the free speech defense by demonstrating that Trump's statements were not opinions, but false statements of fact. The defendant did not say he disliked the Royal Guards or disagreed with their role. He stated, as fact, that they were mannequins who had never seen combat. This is not opinion, this is falsehood, and malicious falsehood at that. Pike's emotional climax came when she addressed the broader implications of the case. This trial is not about politics or nationalism or cultural differences. It is about the fundamental human dignity of those who serve. When we allow the service and sacrifice of our military personnel to be dismissed as performance art, we diminish not just them but ourselves as a society. She concluded by addressing the damages claimed directly. £100 million. Is Thomas Wren's reputation worth that much? Is the reputation of every Royal Guard worth that much? Members of the jury, I submit to you that the honor and dignity of those who risk their lives in service to others is beyond price. But since the defendant chose to attack that honor for his own political benefit, he must pay for the damage he has caused. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which London held its breath. Betting shops had stopped taking wagers on the outcome after Pike's closing argument, and social media was flooded with commentary from legal experts, military veterans, and political pundits. During the deliberation period, an unexpected development occurred. A group of American veterans organized a protest outside the courthouse, but not in support of Trump, as many had expected. Instead, they carried signs reading, "We stand with our British brothers, and heroes are not mannequins." The group included Marines who had served alongside British forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their presence sent a powerful message about military solidarity that transcended national boundaries. Thomas spent the deliberation period with his family, trying to maintain normalcy while the world waited for the verdict. He took Sarah to school each day, helped Margaret with household chores, and attempted to prepare himself for either outcome. In quiet moments, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point and wondered if the cost, financial, emotional, and personal, had been worth it. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, with Judge Hayes recalling the jury after they had indicated they had reached a decision. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathered in adjacent chambers watching on closed-circuit television. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The only sound in the packed courtroom was the soft whir of television cameras, capturing what many observers believed would be a historic moment. Thomas sat ramrod straight, his hands folded in his lap, Margaret beside him with her hand resting supportively on his arm. On the charge of defamation, the foreman announced in a clear voice that carried throughout the hushed courtroom, "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Thomas Wren." The courtroom erupted before the foreman could continue. Cheers and applause from the gallery mixed with the clicking of cameras and the urgent whispers of reporters. Judge Hayes called for order, but it took several minutes for the celebration to die down enough for the proceedings to continue. Furthermore, the foreman continued once quiet had been restored. "We award damages in the amount of £100 million, as requested by the plaintiff." The second eruption was even louder than the first. Thomas himself seemed stunned by the magnitude of the award, turning to Pike with an expression of disbelief. Margaret began crying, overwhelmed by the vindication of her husband's service and the end of their long ordeal. Trump's reaction was immediate and predictable. He shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger, and began shouting about rigged juries and corrupt foreign courts. Judge Hayes threatened him with contempt, and Blackwood had to physically restrain his client to prevent further outburst. In the aftermath of the verdict, the jury foreman was asked by reporters about the decision process. His statement was illuminating. The evidence was overwhelming. We saw a decorated war hero who had risked his life to save others, and we saw a defendant who had deliberately and maliciously attacked that hero's character for political gain. The damages reflected not just the harm to Mr. Wren, but the message that such behavior is unacceptable in a civilized society. The international reaction was swift and largely positive. Military veterans organizations from around the world issued statements supporting the verdict, while political commentators debated the implications for political discourse and free speech. The Pentagon issued a rare statement acknowledging the service of British forces and the importance of Allied cooperation in combat operations. Trump's immediate response was to announce his intention to appeal, calling the verdict the greatest injustice in legal history and claiming that British courts had no jurisdiction over American political figures. His lawyers, however, were more circumspect in their public statements, acknowledging the strength of the evidence while maintaining that the verdict would be overturned on appeal. In the weeks following the verdict, the impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Thomas found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as media outlets around the world sought interviews and commentary. He largely declined, preferring to let his service record speak for itself. But he did agree to a few carefully selected appearances. One of the most powerful moments came during a joint press conference with Jake Ryler and Luis Mendez, who had remained in London to support their former rescuer. The three men stood together outside the courthouse, representing a bond forged in combat and strengthened by their shared experience of Trump's attacks. "This was never about money," Thomas said, reading from a prepared statement while his voice remained steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "This was about respect for everyone who has ever worn the uniform of their country, whether British, American, or any of our allies. Today, that respect has been restored." Ryler's comments were particularly pointed. "I came here because I owed Staff Sergeant Wren a debt I could never repay. But more than that, I came because what Mr. Trump said wasn't just wrong, it was an insult to every person who has ever served." Today's verdict sends a message that service and sacrifice matter, and that words have consequences. The financial implications of the verdict were significant but complex. Trump's legal team immediately moved to place liens on his British assets, while the appeal process played out, but legal experts predicted that the case would ultimately be settled out of court for a substantial but undisclosed amount. Pike announced that any funds recovered would be donated to veteran support charities in both Britain and the United States, with Thomas keeping only enough to cover his legal expenses and family needs. The case also prompted broader discussions about the treatment of military personnel by political figures. Several countries began reviewing their defamation laws as they applied to service members, while military advocacy groups used the case as a rallying cry for greater respect and support for veterans. For Thomas himself, the victory was bittersweet. The legal process had taken a toll on his family, and the publicity had disrupted their quiet life in Surrey. Sarah, now 14, had matured significantly during the ordeal, developing a deeper understanding of service and sacrifice that would shape her character for years to come. She had watched her father stand up for principle despite the personal cost, and the lesson was not lost on her. Margaret returned to her teaching position with a new perspective on the importance of history and civic education. She began incorporating military history into her curriculum, ensuring that her students understood the real cost of the freedom they enjoyed. That as the summer of 2025 approached, Thomas began considering offers to speak at military academies and veteran events. He was reluctant to become a public figure, but he recognized the platform he had been given and the responsibility that came with it. His message was simple but powerful. Service matters. Sacrifice deserves respect. And sometimes standing up for what's right requires fighting battles you never wanted to fight. The case of Wren v. Trump became a landmark in defamation law, cited in legal textbooks and studied by students around the world. But for Thomas, the most important outcome was simpler. When his daughter asked him about his service, she did so with pride instead of shame, and when he walked down the street in his hometown, neighbors nodded with respect rather than pity. In the end, the £100 million lawsuit was about more than money. It was about dignity, honor, and the principle that those who serve deserve better than to be dismissed as mannequins by those who have never worn the uniform themselves. Thomas Wren had fought his last battle, and like all the others, he had won it through courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The verdict stood as a testament to the power of truth over bluster, of character over celebrity, and of the enduring value of military service in a world that too often takes such sacrifice for granted.